Along with AstraZeneca.
Big discussion over blood clots, and that's one of the things. It's happening in people under 65. You're seeing blood clots in the brain, blood clots in the nose, and also in the lungs. Which the lungs, we know that's the deadliest blood clot you can have. Infectious disease experts are saying, though, you're not going to be seeing this in clinical trials because these blood clots are so rare. So they're looking more into, is it people with underlying conditions? Is it more healthy people? They're seeing more underlying conditions.
30 seconds. Tell us what they're trying to do about it.
Changing the name, just like what a lot of companies do to rebrand itself. So it was called the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, changing it to Vaxzevria. It's not an opera. That's the new name that they're calling it.
Vaxzevria.
And the EU health officials did approve it last week. But again, as most companies do to kind of save face, rebrand.
Yeah,
And that's what they're doing.
We'll change the brand because we have a marketing issue.
Well, this video is going to be all about that. There's a problem with the Pfizer vaccine. There's a problem with the AstraZeneca vaccine. In fact, there's a problem with all the COVID vaccines at the minute. And the problem is with the naming of the vaccines. The drug companies know we've got a problem. Medical practitioners know we have a problem. The journalists are now talking about the problem. But the problem isn't going to get fixed in a hurry. And this video will tell you why this thing is a problem and why they need to fix it and why they might not be able to fix it. Go. Back at the end of 2020, Pfizer and AstraZeneca had got their COVID vaccines ready, and they were getting them approved by the drug regulators, and then they started on their next task, which was deciding on the name for their new vaccine. Now, drug companies tend to spend a lot of time on this, sometimes 2 to 3 years just to name one drug, and they spend a lot of money on it too. In 2019, Forbes magazine reported that Pfizer was spending twice as much on marketing and advertising their drugs than on research and development. You know, it's very important to them. Now, there are 3 names that they need. The first is the chemical name, and that's pretty much determined by the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry. So here's a drug you will know, but it's unlikely that you've come across this particular name for it. So N-methyl-free, phenyl-free, 4-trifluoroamine, phenyloxypropanamine. There, nailed it. But well, that name, not really meant to be read out aloud. Certainly not like that. But this drug is, that name is the technical name. It's the name that's the most precise. Marketing has nothing to do with it. And the public generally never see it, so we don't have to worry about that name. The second name is the generic name, which is the name given to the active ingredient in the drug. And the main thing here is that the name is sufficiently distinct from other drugs for not to be confused with those other drugs. But it also has to have an indication in the name of how the drug works. It's the name medical practitioners use, and it needs to be easy to pronounce and easy to read when written down. Why is that important? Well, figures from the National Center for Biotechnology Information state that in the US alone, around 7,000 to 9,000 people die because of medication errors, and hundreds of thousands of people experience adverse reactions that can be really serious. And it's estimated that it costs the US around 40 billion in healthcare costs and involves harm being caused to more than 7 million patients. So it's a big problem, and the most common type of medication errors are failures to communicate drug orders and misreading handwriting and confusion over similarly named drugs. So having a name that avoids having your drug confused with another drug and it's easy to read and easy to say is really important. So that's where we have particular rules they have to follow for these names, and they have to satisfy the requirements of both local drug regulators but also the international non-proprietary name program, which is run by the World Health Organization. But unlike with the chemical name, drug companies can suggest names they think are attractive, so marketing can get involved here. They play a bit of a role. But as I say, there are strict rules they have to follow. The name has to have a particular type of prefix and a particular type of suffix. The prefix, a bit at the start, that has to contain 2 syllables and be distinct and easy to pronounce. Then there's the suffix, which is the bit at the end. That has to give an indication of the drug's not an indication, it has to follow the convention of the drug's class name, the type of drug it is. So each type of drug has a particular suffix to it, and that tells the physician how that drug works in the body. Now, the generic name for N-methyl-free, phenyl-free, 4-trifluoromethyl, well, that one, it's fluoxetine. So the fluox is the differentiating bit, the easy to pronounce syllables in the prefix, and the atine at the end, the suffix, that's what's used for a class of drug that's known as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. This is a fancy name for drugs that increase the level of the neurotransmitter serotonin in the brain. It's also known as the SSRI family of drugs. I've got a couple of videos on that on the channel. Now, consumers never see this name. Well, it's on the packaging, but generally they don't use the name. They don't really pay much attention to the name. It's mostly there for physicians, largely to help them avoid making those prescription errors, prescribing the wrong drug. Now, the third name is the brand name. The brand name also has to satisfy requirements of being sufficiently distinct from other drug brand names to make sure no mistakes are made with prescriptions. So brand names do need to be approved by drug regulators as well. But there's much more room here for marketing folk to be creative, to make the drug sound appealing to its target market. So, for example, with drugs that treat conditions often associated with older people, drug companies often use a name that sounds comforting and reassuring, can also have a sound similar to the condition that's being treated, like Rheumatrix, which is a treatment for rheumatoid arthritis. When a drug's targeted at a younger market, you can often get more dynamic sounding names, and that's where you get the name Prozac, which is a brand name for the generic drug fluoxetine. There, got there in the end. Now, all of this naming takes time, and with the COVID vaccine, we haven't had much time, so drug companies are pretty quick to start trying to name their vaccine. Largely they were doing this by autumn of last year, just about a year ago. And drug companies were coming up with the brand names for these new vaccines that they're developing. But vaccines are not easy to give a brand name to, and that's because the target market is so large, practically everybody. And that's a really tough target audience, as it's so diverse. How do you come up with a name that appeals to everybody? But with a vaccine, it's not actually a real problem, because you don't have to make your brand name appealing to the public, because the public doesn't take any notice of brand names for vaccines generally. So in Australia, the brand names of the flu vaccines available this year, 2021, are Vaxzevria Tetra, Fluarix Tetra, and Afluria Quad. But you'll probably have never heard of those names, even if you're in Australia. People don't take notice of those names. The people who do take notice of those names are drug regulators and advisory bodies. So in Australia, we have the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, ATAGI, which advises the government on immunisation programmes, and they provide the guidance on which vaccines the government should buy and which healthcare providers then use. So the healthcare providers, though, then go and use those drugs that the ATAGI has advised the government needs to buy. So they're only generally they're the only people who see the brand names of the drug. The public just generally turns up and asks for a flu vaccine, and they get what they're given. The only exception is if there's a problem with a particular flu vaccine and the media tells the story, then people might use that brand name and say, I don't want that drug. But largely that doesn't happen. People just refer to getting the flu vaccine, or they ask for the flu vaccine. But things have gone a bit odd with the COVID vaccines, because people have decided to name the vaccines after the drug companies that are producing them. And this is not something that usually happens. But with COVID, it's happening largely because of how much public attention there's been on the COVID pandemic and the efforts to develop a vaccine. The public have been quite understandably following that story very closely, and when drug companies successfully developed the vaccines, the public called those vaccines after the drugs company. So AstraZeneca vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, and the Moderna vaccine. Now, this initially played out well for the drug companies because, they developed a vaccine, that everyone was kind of celebrating that the vaccines had been developed. But they're now getting concerned. And they're concerned for a number of reasons. And it's not that simple. It's not as simple as the journalists on that TV show seem to make out. First of all, it's not good practice to have a drug that hasn't got a brand name that keeps it sufficiently distinguishable from other drugs, because it can create confusion among prescribing physicians. But it's also risky in relation for a drug to be associated primarily with a drug company, because if the drug gets any negative attention, that negativity will attach to the company name rather than the brand name. And that's what those journalists were picking up on. And we can see it happening in Australia with the AstraZeneca vaccine because of media attention on the risk of fatal blood clots from the AstraZeneca vaccine and the government's poor communication around vaccine safety. So now AstraZeneca vaccine is getting a bad name. The only other COVID vaccine available in Australia at present is the Pfizer vaccine. So that's been seen as the preferred vaccine. So Pfizer might be quite happy to have their company name associated with the drug. But the adverse effects of that drug haven't yet started to become known, and they will become known. It's happy days for Pfizer at the moment because the name has been associated with a positive vaccine, a vaccine that people want to take. But all drugs have adverse effects, and it's only a matter of time before those adverse effects become known. They're quite rare, usually. Hopefully they will be with the COVID vaccines, but the more people who take the drugs, there's the increased chances of people getting these adverse effects. So they start to become known. And also, we don't yet know the long-term effects of these drugs, and there will be some longer-term adverse effects that only show up in the longer term after people have been taking these vaccines for a few years. So we don't know what they are yet. And that's likely to emerge as time goes on. Again, hopefully the adverse effects are rare, but things will show up. And when that happens, it will tarnish Pfizer's name, just in the way that AstraZeneca's name is being tarnished. So drug companies don't want their company name to be associated with the drug because of those things. In Australia, Pfizer was the first out of the blocks to register a brand name for its vaccine. This was back in October last year. It registered the name of Comirnaty. If you get a Pfizer vaccine, you'll see that name on the file, the little bottle, if you're brave enough to look around. Now, AstraZeneca began registering their names for vaccines back in July this year, and one of the names they've got is Vaxzevria, which is not that easy to say, actually, after a couple of drinks. In Australia, they just got that name approved by the drug regulator here, and AstraZeneca are pretty keen for that name to start to be used in place of the AstraZeneca vaccine. But it's not just that worry of having their company's name tarnished if the drug receives negative attention. That's the thing that the media are picking up on at the moment, being a bit cynical, but understandably so, because of the bad behavior of drug companies in the past. Got videos on that as well. But it's also because there's a real problem coming down the pipe when people who will get confused over the different types of vaccines, because these companies actually produce lots of different vaccines. So if we're not careful, we might have mistakes down the track when COVID is not front and center and it becomes unclear what people mean when they say they want to have the Pfizer vaccine. Which one? And it's also causing a problem for governments. Governments are getting nervous because with the vaccine having these distinct names at the moment, when usually they don't, and the names being attached by the public to these drugs, and they're attaching the company name to these drugs, it means the public are able to express a preference for one drug over another, which is complicating things in Australia, because Australia bought a whole bucket load of AstraZeneca vaccine, didn't buy very much Pfizer vaccine, and now, of course, everyone wants Pfizer vaccine. And we have lots of people who before, we had this thing about vaccine hesitancy. People were hesitant about getting vaccinated. Well, now it's hesitancy for a different reason. It's hesitancy through people exercising their consumer choice. People are holding back from getting vaccinated until their preferred vaccine becomes available. And that's causing the government all sorts of problems, and the government's desperately trying to say, look, just take whatever vaccine is there. Whatever vaccine is available is the right vaccine for you. That's what they're saying in Australia at the moment. And it's because people are exercising their consumer choice. And that doesn't usually happen with vaccines. And it's causing big headaches for the government right now in Australia. So it will be interesting to see if the drug companies try to push harder on replacing their company names with these brand names, whether the government will push harder on that, and whether the public will accept the brand names and refer to having their second dose of Comirnaty rather than their second dose of Pfizer. Who knows what's going to happen, but I think it's going to be interesting, whatever happens. Okay, that's all for now. Ta-da.
Thoughts on this? Dr. Bob Arnott, infectious disease expert. He joins us now to pick up the conversation. Is that the right answer? They're simply going to they're going to change their name and rebrand as Astrovirus or something. Bob, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think the public's that stupid. I don't think rebranding's really going to help.